Hi everyone. Now that we have talked about what community practice is under the realm of macro practice, and we have an idea of what some of the models of practice and theories of community practice entail, which of course we're going to delve more deeply into as we move through the semester. What we need to focus on today is what we actually mean by the term community. We've been talking about that term a lot already, but maybe we haven't even really paid attention to what it actually means or what it looks like. So that's what we're going to start with today, is looking at what is a community, how is it defined, what is it comprised of, what are the different types of communities, and having a better understanding of what a community entails will help us better know how to conduct community needs assessments and community mapping, and how to utilize that information in order to build community. So we will be introduced to the idea of community building today as well, and that will give us a good framework for other things that we'll talk about next. So understanding communities, a definition. Community is a dynamic whole that emerges when a group of people participate in common practices, depend upon one another, make decisions together, identify themselves as part of something larger than the sum of their individual relationships, and commit themselves for the long term to their own, one another's, and the group's well-being. There are different aspects to community, and those aspects include things like a community bond, things that are common that unite people together and form those bonds through relationships and commonalities. Another aspect that makes a community is history. So having similar experiences in a certain period of time, experiencing those things together creates a shared history, which helps create and build and nurture those community bonds and helps define a community as a whole. Communities also have certain missions or goals or objectives or reasons or purposes for being, I guess you could say, that members of communities identify as something that they have in common, a common cause or a common purpose to identify together. Communities entail membership of some kind, people who buy into those shared missions, who are invested in those community bonds and have that shared experience and history. That helps them identify a membership to the community as a whole. Another aspect of community is cultural values. So that includes different beliefs, different norms, social norms, different practices and traditions, different lifestyles, different ways of doing things. Those are all part of cultural values, which also help to identify communities. Communities also have aspects of structure. Sometimes there's a hierarchy or a defined linear or even circular relationship among members of the community. So there's some kind of a structure and formation or layout of the community that helps define its boundaries or parameters or power structures or communication patterns or that kind of thing. Language and communication styles is another aspect of communities. This is usually something that is shared by the group or the members of the community. Sometimes it's official language, or it might be a dialect or a slang, or the ways in which communication are utilized, how people communicate with people at different ages or different places in the life trajectory, how they may communicate with or relate to people that are, how they relate to men versus women, how they relate to people in certain positions, whether they're doctors or lawyers or clergy or something else. Those styles or patterns of language and communication also help define what a community might look like. Then you also have current circumstances. Circumstances definitely play into aspects of communities. You think about certain current events, maybe climate issues or environmental situations. Those are things that can be quite bonding for particular groups of people and create membership in a specific community. And so that is an important aspect to keep in mind as well. Activities also can be aspects of community that bring people together in a group that share an identity within a community where they feel that they're all a member of the same group, and that can be based on specific activities. And throughout all of these different aspects of communities, you have the connections that are made amongst the members or the group, the people in the group who identify as a part of that community. Those connections are an important part to the structure and the boundaries and sometimes the purpose of the community, however it may be defined. So with all those aspects of communities in mind, we can see that there are a lot of different types of communities. So just briefly, we have place-based communities that are based on some kind of geographic location, whether that be residential or commercial, or a certain part of town or a certain part of the country or a certain part of the world, but it's locational by nature. So those geographic boundaries can be the defining the definition of what a community might entail, where it might be. A family can be a community, and that might be the traditional identified family, parents, siblings, extended family, etc. Or it can be family in the sense of our chosen family members. And, people that you might call your family, even if there's no blood or legal ties to connect you together. But a family can be a community. Faith communities are another type of community that people identify with. So you can identify with a religion or a spiritual ideology or a specific kind of faith tradition, and the other people or members of that community also identify with the same faith ideologies. That can create a community amongst those members. Workplace can also be a community. So the people you work with, the area in which you work, a department or division or organization as a whole, or a system of care, that can be a community in and of itself. You can think of just some examples, like people that are a part of the military. They work in the military. The military kind of has its own little culture, right? And a community within itself that's easily identifiable. easily distinguished from other kinds of workplaces, maybe in the medical field or in social work or in some other type of workplace. You can see those distinctions. There are also types of communities that are defined by social connections and cultural connections or circumstance. So examples of some of these might include, when you hear talk about like the Black community or the Latino community, or those are examples of cultural groups or cultural communities. Circumstance might be, communities that have experienced major environmental situations or weather-related emergencies. So you think about people that experienced Hurricane Katrina, for example, or when 9/11 happened, people that were directly impacted by that circumstance of 9/11, or when there's a major tsunami or earthquake or natural disaster of any kind, or if there is, wildfires, or if there's a drought or flooding, those can be communities of impact or circumstance when there's that type of shared connection, shared experience that can be very bonding. So that would be some examples of a type of community based on circumstance. Identificational communities also, have their own distinctions that can be based on, how people identify as far as how people identify. Maybe it's based on sex or gender or sexual orientation, or it might be how people identify as far as if they're an athlete or a professional, or if they're an academic, or if they're based on a specific hobby or practice or something that they're involved in. If identifying as being a philanthropist, there's a community of philanthropy that is separated out from other types of communities, and those are kind of identificational types of communities based on how a person might identify. So the thing about the different types of communities is that people seldom belong to just one community, right? So most people are members of several communities at one time. So the types of communities we're involved with are overlapping, and we often see communities within communities, or like almost some subsets that coexist. So there's a lot of intersectionality between these kinds of communities that people identify as members of, and we could go through this with ourselves and identify, the neighborhood in which you live in. You're probably, feel like you're a member of some sort of community. Some places, some residential locations are more bonded or community focused than others, right? But for the most part, we probably all identify with some type of a geographic location as a community that we're a member of. Sometimes we might not even realize that until we're out of the community. So like you may or may not identify as an Omahan or a Nebraskan until you're out of the city or out of the state, and you're talking about where you live or comparing things that you do, or how we do things here, how we talk, or common things that make Nebraskans Nebraskans, or things that make people that live in Omaha kind of seem similar. That's sometimes we notice those more when we're not in our community. And we're all members of families of some kind. Some of us are members of faith communities and identify as such. A lot of us also are a part of a workplace community of some kind, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of intersectionality that takes place amongst people and their memberships in different types of communities. And so we want to definitely appreciate that and recognize that when working with people, that there's a lot of different types of communities, and there's layers of communities that are woven together by the shared members and the interaction of each sub-community within the other types of communities. And that's important to recognize when working with clients, as well as recognizing in ourselves as well. So understanding how communities are defined and intersect is essential to advance community practice. A community's well-being is dependent on the quality of relationships, or social capital, among the citizens of that community or the members of that community. Social capital creates a sense of belonging, thus enhancing the overall welfare of a community as a whole. People working together with shared understandings and expectations are what provide a place of strong community. So understanding the parameters of an identified community and what makes for a strong, healthy community helps us recognize when change might be needed. It allows us to explore specific needs and strengths through a community needs assessment, including a capacity inventory and mapping process. And this leads to understanding the underlying community building framework that guides all community practice, whether we're talking about community development, community organizing, community engagement, community activism, or the like. Community building in general is basically a means to address perceived social inequality and injustice, individual and collective well-being, and the negative impacts of otherwise disconnected and or marginalized individuals. The concept of community building within the context of restoring a community is one of possibility, generosity, and gifts, rather than one of problem solving, fear, and retribution. It requires its community members to act authentically by choosing to own and exercise their power themselves, rather than delegating it to others and delegating what is in the best interest of that community. Focus must be inclusive for all, and not just the leaders, but each and every member of that community. So when talking about community building, we want to ensure that we have a good understanding of those common principles of community building. Now that we understand the definition of community and the different types of communities and the different aspects of communities that really define or determine what a community entails. So those common principles include initiatives that are community specific, however that community is defined. Remember, it might just be a group of people that have a shared interest or experience, or it could be a group of people that are part of a geographic location. So the boundaries are more geographically or locationally defined rather than interest defined, or shared experience defined, or identity defined, or etc. Another common principle of community building is that initiatives benefit from community assets. And we're going to talk a lot more about this particular principle, in the next couple of weeks during the semester, but essentially we're talking about resources or positive traits within a community that can be used for good and can be used to overcome adversities, can be used to strengthen the community and empower community members. Initiatives require relationship building, so it's about engaging with community members, building that rapport and trust, and not just creating and building them, but nurturing those relationships. Relationship is critical to any kind of community practice. Without strong relationships, positive outcomes will be very limited, and the effectiveness of your community practice strategies will be limited as well. Initiatives involve collective vision, so it has to be something that everyone buys into and where there's some kind of a consensus about, because if it's not a collective agreement towards change, or if there's not a common goal and an agreement on how to reach that goal, again, your community practice efforts might not be as successful as you'd like them to be. Initiatives also involve community decision making. So the decisions are shared amongst the members of the community. They're not decisions made by outside parties or experts or non-members. The community decision making is a critical part of community building and a critical component to community practice as a whole. And lastly, initiatives depend on community participation. So you can see how all of these sort of intersect with each other or overlap. So community participation is critical to success of community building and community practice, because those are the people that are affected by any change or any efforts to address a social problem or a community issue. They will be directly influenced by it, and they're the ones that therefore have a vested interest in participating in addressing an issue or making any changes. So it's critical to have active participation from within the community members themselves. They should be the ones driving the bus, so to speak. They should be the ones that are identifying what changes need to be made and how to get them made and who's going to do what in that plan, and how are the people affected going to be the ones participating in the situation rather than just being a benefactor or beneficiary rather, or whatever. So community specific, focus on community assets, requiring relationship building, involving a collective vision, involving community decision making, and are dependent on community participation. Those are the key principles of community building. Also, with regard to community building and community impact work, there are some other things that we want to be familiar with as well. We're talking about partnerships with this kind of work, and partnerships involve people who are essentially agents. They're not an object of action. It is, we do this with, not for people, their communities, and their organizations. That's sort of the motto of partnerships. It's also about inclusion. Diversity is highly desirable in community building practices. We are not an exclusive club or group of people. We help set a table for all who want to act together. That's the motto, if you will, of inclusion with regard to community building. And assets, again, is another term that alludes to caring communities that are built on strengths from the inside out. While we acknowledge that there's limits and needs sometimes, the focus is really on capacities and how to link to them and link them together. It also has to deal with results. So while we attend to numbers of participants and actions, we judge ourselves by the results which have been established by a free and open community process. That is sort of the motto of the results of community practice, or community building rather, is that it is about people focusing on or judging the results based on a free and open community process. That dialogue and participation and empowerment process is really important to the results, and that's how results are sometimes defined. Integrity is the other important impact part. This refers to all functions that are integrated into the mission and vision of the community, and community building or impact is not an add-on or a separate project, but it's built into the integrity of the process as a whole. So it's not just about the outcome, it's about the process and kind of having integrity or fidelity to the actions that are part of that community building process. All that we do is oriented to the strengthening of caring communities. That's sort of the motto of integrity as far as the impact of community building goes. And the next one is about being holistic. So human communities have many interacting dimensions. We know this even from our other courses where we talk about the biopsychosocial framework, right? So we understand that holistic approach to the human experience and how it's multidimensional. And understanding that strengthens the social infrastructure of communities. We connect to the economic, political, personal, and spiritual dimensions. You know, that holistic framework is important to this, and that's sort of the motto of the holistic component to the impact of community building and community practice. And lastly, we have learning. And learning refers to thriving communities and organizations that are continually learning, thinking about and recognizing that we are at a different point of understanding and that growth demands a total systems approach in which we are all brought along together. So understanding the dynamic interconnections between different aspects of our environment and our membership in these different types of communities is important to the learning process, which affects directly the impact of community building efforts. So those are the different aspects of community building and common principles. We're going to hear much more about these ideas around this underlying framework of community building with other topics within this class this semester, but this is a good introduction to what we will be talking about next.